Hello, dear listener, and welcome to this quiet corner of the evening, where stories unfold like gentle whispers against window panes. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight, to this place of shadow and candlelight, where mysteries drift through the fog and solutions emerge as softly as dawn, breaking over London's ancient rooftops. This evening, we shall journey together through a tale of disappearance and discovery, of secrets hidden in the depths of winter, and of truths revealed by the careful application of reason and observation. Before we begin, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're tucked beneath warm blankets as rain patters against your window. Or maybe you're watching streetlights cast their golden glow across quiet streets. Wherever you find yourself in this wide world, know that you are welcome here, in this space we create together, this sanctuary of story and stillness. Tonight's narrative asks nothing of you save that you allow yourself to drift, to float upon the current of words as they wash over you like waves upon a distant shore. There is no urgency here, no demand for alertness or tension. Simply let the mystery unfold at its own measured pace. Let the images form and dissolve like smoke from Holmes's pipe. And if sleep should claim you before our tale concludes, then sleep has done its proper work. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The fire crackled softly in the hearth at 227B Baker Street, its amber light dancing across the familiar walls of those well-appointed rooms where so many extraordinary cases had found their genesis. Outside, December rain whispered against the window panes with that peculiar persistence that characterizes London's deepest winter evenings, when darkness falls before the afternoon has properly concluded, and the city wraps itself in layers of mist and lamplight. I sat in my customary chair, a medical journal open upon my lap, though my attention had wandered from its pages some time ago, drawn instead to the mesmerizing patterns the firelight painted upon the ceiling. Sherlock Holmes occupied his own chair across from me, his long fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, his grey eyes fixed upon some point in the middle distance that existed, I suspected, more in his remarkable mind than in our actual sitting room. He had been silent for the better part of an hour, which was not unusual, though the quality of his silence suggested not boredom, but rather deep contemplation. The rain provided a soothing rhythm to our quietude, and I found myself surrendering to that particular contentment that comes from being warm and dry, while the elements conduct their business beyond the walls. The coals in the grate shifted with a soft sigh, sending up a small constellation of sparks that glowed briefly before fading into darkness. Steam rose from the teapot Mrs. Hudson had brought up earlier, curling in delicate spirals toward the ceiling, carrying with it the comforting aroma of Darjeeling, mixed with just a hint of bergamot. The scent mingled with the ever-present trace of Holmes's tobacco, that distinctive shag he favoured, which had permeated every fabric and paper in our lodgings, until it had become as much a part of the rooms as the wallpaper itself. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through the rain's gentle percussion without disturbing the evening's essential tranquility. "Do you recall the name Ashford?" I lifted my gaze from the journal, considering. "The Ashford family of Northumberland? I believe you mentioned them once in connection with some matter of a disputed inheritance." "The very same," Holmes replied, though he did not shift his position or redirect his gaze. "Though the matter I assisted them with some 3 years ago was considerably more delicate, than a mere question of property law. It concerned the rather spectacular disappearance of the family's eldest son during what should have been a routine hunting expedition on their estate. "I don't recall you mentioning a disappearance," I said, setting aside my journal and reaching for my teacup, which had cooled to that perfect temperature where the liquid slides across the tongue without any sensation of heat, only flavor and comfort. "The family desired discretion," Holmes explained, finally turning his attention toward me, his eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that made them seem to glow with their own inner illumination. The young man reappeared after 48 hours with no memory of his absence and no apparent harm done. I determined that he had suffered a peculiar reaction to a medication prescribed by an overzealous physician, which had caused a temporary fugue state. The matter was resolved quietly, the physician properly chastened, and the family returned to their customary routines. "Then why do you mention them now?" I asked, taking another slow sip of tea and savouring the way it warmed my chest as it descended. Holmes reached toward the small table beside his chair, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and produced a telegram that I had not previously noticed lying there. The yellow paper seemed to glow in the firelight as he held it up, though he did not yet offer it to me. "Because I received this communication approximately 2 hours ago. It seems the Ashford family has experienced another disappearance, though this time the circumstances are rather different. The missing individual is Sir Edmund Ashford himself, the family patriarch, and he has been absent for 5 days. The rain intensified slightly, drumming against the windows with renewed purpose, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the muffled sound of a hansom cab rattling over wet cobblestones. A gust of wind sent a tendril of smoke back down the chimney, and the fire wavered for just a moment before reasserting itself with a soft whoosh. Holmes extended the telegram toward me, and I rose from my chair to accept it, my feet carrying me across the familiar carpet whose pattern I could have traced from memory. The paper felt slightly damp, as though it had absorbed moisture from the evening air during its journey to our rooms. I held it toward the lamp on Holmes's side table, letting the gaslight illuminate the text. The message was brief, composed in that truncated style necessitated by the telegraph's economics. "Sir Edmund vanished. 5 days stop. No trace. Stop circumstances. Most peculiar. Stop your assistance. Urgently requested. Stop. Please come immediately. Stop. Lady Ashford." "Most peculiar," I murmured, echoing the telegram's own phrase. "In what way peculiar, I wonder?" "That is precisely what we shall endeavour to discover," Holmes replied, rising from his chair with that fluid grace that always seemed at odds with his angular frame. He moved to the window, drawing back the curtain to gaze out into the rain-soaked street below. "I have already sent my response, indicating that we shall take the morning train to Northumberland. I trust you have no pressing obligations that would prevent your accompaniment." "None whatsoever," I assured him, feeling that familiar flutter of anticipation that always preceded our investigations, tempered this evening by the hour and the weather into something gentler, more contemplative than exciting, though I confess, travelling to Northumberland in December seems a recipe for considerable discomfort. The Ashford estate, Ravenswood Manor, is reputed to be most welcoming, Holmes said, turning back from the window. "And besides, Watson, you know as well as I that the most intriguing cases seldom present themselves during convenient seasons or at reasonable hours." He moved to his desk, which stood against the far wall, perpetually covered with papers, books, chemical apparatus, and the various detritus of his investigations. His fingers moved across the clutter with practiced efficiency, sorting and selecting items he deemed necessary for our journey. The sound of paper rustling joined the rain's rhythm and the fire's crackle, creating a symphony of small sounds that seemed to encapsulate the very essence of our Baker Street sanctuary. I returned to my chair, settling back into its familiar embrace and watching Holmes as he prepared. There was something almost ritualistic about these moments before an investigation truly began. A gathering of resources, both mental and material. A transition from the contemplative life of our London rooms to the active pursuit of truth and clarity. The lamplight cast his shadow long across the wall, making him seem taller still, a silhouette of focused intention against the warm glow. "Tell me what you know of the family's current situation," I requested, knowing that Holmes would have researched their circumstances before agreeing to take the case. Holmes did not pause in his preparations as he spoke. Sir Edmund Ashford is 73 years of age, a widower these past 7 years, though he remarried 2 years ago to a woman some 30 years his junior, a former governess named Catherine Newbury, which naturally caused some consternation among the family and the local society. He has 3 children from his first marriage, the aforementioned Thomas, who experienced the previous disappearance, currently aged 38, a daughter, Eleanor, aged 35, married to a gentleman farmer, and another son, William, aged 32, who serves in Her Majesty's Diplomatic Corps and is currently stationed in Constantinople. The rain seemed to soften as Holmes spoke, falling now in steady sheets rather than gusty bursts, and the resulting sound had an almost lullaby quality, a white noise that encouraged the mind to drift even as it remained tethered to the thread of narrative. "Sir Edmund," Holmes continued, selecting a small magnifying glass and slipping it into his coat pocket, "is a man of regular habits, methodical to a fault, devoted to the management of his estate and to his historical research. He has published several scholarly papers on Roman settlements in Northumberland, and is considered something of an authority on the subject. He walks the estate grounds each morning without fail, regardless of weather, and retires each evening at precisely 9 o'clock. By all accounts, he is in excellent health for his age, both physically and mentally." "And the circumstances of his disappearance?" I asked, feeling my eyes grow heavy, though my interest remained keen. A pleasant contradiction, the mind engaged while the body relaxed into the evening's embrace. Holmes paused in his preparations, turning to face me fully. The firelight illuminated one side of his face, while leaving the other in shadow, creating a study in contrasts. According to Lady Ashford's initial communication, she sent a letter in addition to the telegram, which arrived earlier today. Sir Edmund excused himself from the dinner table 5 evenings ago, claiming a desire to fetch a particular book from the library. He never returned. When the household went to search for him, they found the library empty, the book he had mentioned still on its shelf, and no indication of where he might have gone. The exterior doors were all locked from the inside, the windows secured, and the night was sufficiently cold and stormy that the notion of him venturing outside seemed absurd. Yet he was not in the house. I felt a small chill despite the fire's warmth, though it was the pleasant sort of shiver that accompanies a good mystery rather than actual cold. He simply vanished. So it would appear. Holmes confirmed. The estate was searched thoroughly, as were the grounds once daylight permitted. The local constabulary were summoned and conducted their own investigation with, Lady Ashford indicates, a singular lack of imagination or results. No body has been discovered, no ransom demanded, no explanation forthcoming. Sir Edmund Ashford has, by all appearances, simply ceased to exist somewhere between the dining room and the library of his own home. A log in the fireplace broke apart, settling deeper into the grate with a sound like a sigh, and fresh flames leapt up to caress the new arrangement of wood and coal. The sudden increase in light made the room seem even cozier, even more separate from the wet darkness beyond our walls. Holmes returned his attention to his preparations, but his movements had slowed, becoming more contemplative. "There is one additional detail," he said softly, his voice taking on that particular quality it assumed when he had saved some especially intriguing element for last. Lady Ashford mentions that Sir Edmund had been behaving somewhat unusually in the weeks preceding his disappearance. Nothing dramatic, she emphasizes, but small alterations in his routine. He had begun spending considerable time in the estate's oldest wing, which had been largely closed off for years due to the expense of heating and maintaining it. He had also requested that various documents and maps be retrieved from the family archives, though he did not explain his purpose in studying them. "Do you suspect the new wife?" I asked, knowing that Holmes would expect the question, and would have already formulated several theories regarding her potential involvement. "I suspect nothing without data," Holmes replied, though a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "However, I observe that a woman of modest means who marries a wealthy man significantly, her senior, and is then confronted with his disappearance, occupies a position of considerable interest from an investigative standpoint. Whether that interest is justified, we shall determine through observation and evidence rather than assumption." Outside, a church bell tolled the hour, 9 deep, resonant notes that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of our building. The sound was muffled by the rain and distance, transformed into something almost dreamlike, a reminder that the city continued its rhythms beyond our warm sanctuary. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sounded on the stairs, ascending at her customary measured pace, and a moment later came her gentle knock upon our door. "Come," Holmes called, and our landlady entered, bearing a tray with fresh tea and a plate of her excellent biscuits, the kind she made with butter and just a hint of lemon zest that made them somehow both comforting and refreshing simultaneously. "I thought you gentlemen might appreciate some refreshment," she said, setting the tray upon the table between our chairs. "And Mr. Holmes, I've taken the liberty of ensuring your travelling bag is properly prepared for a winter journey. I've included extra wool socks and your heavier muffler." "You are a treasure beyond price, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said with genuine warmth, and our landlady's face coloured slightly with pleasure at the compliment. "Will you be gone long?" she asked, beginning to gather up the previous tea things with efficient movements. "Several days at minimum, I should expect," Holmes replied, "though with mysteries of this nature, one can never be entirely certain. I shall wire you if our absence is to be extended significantly." Mrs. Hudson nodded, seeming satisfied with this response, and withdrew with the used crockery, leaving behind the fresh tea steaming gently and the biscuits arranged in a neat spiral on their plate. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and we were returned to our private world of firelight and rain. I poured fresh tea for both of us, the act itself a meditation of sorts. The careful angle of the pot, the sound of liquid meeting porcelain, the gradual rise of steam carrying its aromatic promise. Holmes accepted his cup with a nod of thanks and moved to stand before the fireplace, one arm resting upon the mantelpiece in a pose I had seen him assume countless times during contemplation. "You are wondering," he said, without looking at me, "why this particular case has captured my interest when the details are still so vague, and the outcome could very well prove mundane." It was true, though I had not been consciously aware of the wondering until he named it. The thought had crossed my mind, I admitted, taking one of the biscuits and finding it still warm from the oven. Mrs. Hudson must have prepared them fresh upon learning of our impending journey. "2 reasons," Holmes said, sipping his tea and staring into the flames as though they might reveal some truth visible to him alone. "First, the combination of impossibility and precision. Sir Edmund did not simply disappear. He disappeared from a locked house, leaving behind no clues to his departure, in the midst of winter weather that should have left some trace of his passage. The circumstances suggest either careful planning or genuine impossibility, and both options intrigue me considerably." He paused, taking another slow sip of tea, and I waited patiently for him to continue, knowing that he would do so in his own time. The rain had settled into a steady, gentle pattern now, no longer varying in intensity, but maintaining a constant whisper against the windows. It created the sensation that our rooms existed in some space outside normal time, a pocket of permanence in a world of change and flow. "The second reason," Holmes continued, "is the detail about his unusual behavior in the weeks before the disappearance. A man of strict habits who alters those habits is a man responding to some new information or stimulus. What might cause a 73-year-old scholar and landowner to suddenly take an interest in sealed wings and archived documents? What discovery or realization might drive such a change? These questions suggest depths to this case that go beyond a simple disappearance, whether voluntary or otherwise." "You think he discovered something?" I said, understanding beginning to dawn. "Something in his historical research, perhaps, that led him to investigate the older portions of his own home." "I think it highly probable," Holmes agreed, turning from the fire to face me, his eyes bright with that particular intensity that signaled his intellect fully engaged. "And I think it equally probable that whatever he discovered bears some relationship to his current absence. Whether he fled from something, went towards something, or fell victim to something remains to be determined. But the pattern suggests purpose rather than chance, design rather than accident." Holmes returned to his chair, settling into it with a sigh of satisfaction, and regarding me with an expression that was almost affectionate. "You're wondering if you should begin packing," he observed, "but you're also comfortable where you are and reluctant to disturb the evening's tranquility." "You know me too well," I said with a slight laugh. "There is no urgency tonight," Holmes assured me, closing his eyes and leaning his head back against the chair. "Our train departs at 9 tomorrow morning, which allows ample time for preparation. Tonight, we may simply rest here, gathering our resources and allowing our minds to drift across the known facts like water flowing over stones, smoothing and shaping them into patterns we might not consciously perceive, but which nevertheless inform our understanding." This was Holmes in a rare mood, contemplative rather than kinetic, willing to let the investigation breathe and develop rather than attacking it with his usual fierce intensity. I recognized these moments as valuable, for they often preceded his most brilliant insights, as though his mind required periods of apparent rest to process information at levels below conscious thought. We sat in companionable silence for a long while, sipping our tea and listening to the rain. The fire continued its soft conversation with the wood, a language of pops and hisses and gentle roaring that spoke of transformation and consumption, of potential energy becoming light and warmth and ash. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily, marking the passage of minutes with mechanical precision. Yet somehow the time seemed to both pass swiftly and stretch endlessly, as though the evening existed in its own temporal space. My thoughts drifted to previous cases, to other winter journeys undertaken at Holmes's side, to mysteries solved and dangers faced in partnership with this remarkable man whose friendship had become the defining relationship of my adult life. The familiar rooms of Baker Street seemed to hold all those memories within their walls, layered like sedimentary rock, each case leaving its trace in some small way. A book added to the shelf, a chemical stain on the workbench, a bullet hole carefully preserved as a reminder of dramatic moments. "Watson," Holmes murmured, his eyes still closed, his voice barely above a whisper, "you should retire. We have a long day ahead of us tomorrow, and you'll want to be well rested for the journey and for whatever we may discover at Ravenswood Manor." "And you?" I asked, noting that he showed no signs of moving from his chair. "I shall remain here a while longer," he replied. "There are a few threads I wish to follow through my mental archives, connections I want to explore while the house is quiet and my mind is free to wander. You know I require less sleep than most, and I find these late hours particularly conducive to certain types of thought." I finished my tea and stood, feeling the stiffness that comes from sitting too long in one position, accompanied by the pleasant heaviness that presages good sleep. "Don't stay up all night," I advised, knowing even as I spoke that the admonition was likely futile. "Even your formidable constitution benefits from rest." Holmes opened one eye and regarded me with amusement. "Your medical concern is noted and appreciated, Doctor, if not necessarily heeded. Sleep well." I crossed to the door of my own room, pausing with my hand on the knob to look back at Holmes, silhouetted against the fireplace, a figure of contemplation and quiet intensity. The scene seemed to encapsulate something essential about our life together in these rooms. The balance between action and reflection, between the pursuit of truth and the appreciation of comfort, between the extraordinary nature of the cases we investigated and the ordinary rhythms of domestic existence. "Good night, Holmes," I said softly. "Good night, Watson," he replied without opening his eyes. "Dream well, and we shall see what mysteries tomorrow brings." I slept deeply that night, lulled by the rain's persistent rhythm and the comfort of knowing that morning would bring purpose and direction. When I woke, grey winter light was filtering through my curtains, and I could hear Holmes moving about in the sitting room with the particular energy that indicated he had indeed spent much of the night in thought and was now eager to translate contemplation into action. By the time I had washed and dressed, Mrs. Hudson had brought up breakfast, eggs and toast, bacon still sizzling slightly, fresh tea sending up its aromatic steam. Holmes was already dressed for travel in his heavy coat and travelling cape, his bag packed and waiting by the door. He ate sparingly, as was his custom, his attention clearly already focused on the journey ahead and the mystery awaiting us in Northumberland. "The rain has stopped," he observed, gesturing toward the window, where indeed the morning showed clear, if grey and cold. "Though I suspect we'll find different weather once we travel north. Northumberland in December is not known for its clemency." We finished our breakfast in relatively companionable silence, the morning having a different quality than the previous evening, less drowsy and contemplative, more purposeful and forward-looking, though still touched with that sense of beginning something significant. Mrs. Hudson fussed over our warm clothing and provisions for the journey, pressing a package of sandwiches and a flask of tea into my hands, despite my protests that we could certainly obtain refreshment on the train. Trains are always either too hot or too cold, and the tea is inevitably terrible, she declared with the finality of long experience. "At least you'll have something decent to sustain you." A hansom cab arrived precisely on schedule, summoned by the boy Holmes employed for such errands, and we loaded our bags into its interior before settling ourselves against the worn leather seats. The driver clicked to his horse, and we lurched into motion, joining the morning flow of traffic through London's awakening streets. The city passed by the cab's windows like a moving painting. Shopkeepers opening their establishments, early workers hurrying to their positions, chimney smoke beginning to thicken the air as household fires were stoked against the winter cold. Frost still lingered in shadows where the weak sunlight had not yet reached, sketching delicate patterns on windows and railings. The horses' hooves provided a steady rhythm, punctuated by the rattle of wheels over cobblestones and the occasional call of street vendors beginning their daily circuits. We arrived at King's Cross Station with time to spare, which Holmes had calculated with his usual precision. The great terminus was already busy despite the early hour, filled with the sounds of engines venting steam, porters calling out arrivals and departures, travellers greeting or farewelling companions. The vast space echoed with human activity and mechanical purpose. Yet, there was something almost soothing about the organised chaos, the sense that everyone present was engaged in the purposeful act of going somewhere or welcoming someone back. Our train stood waiting at its platform, a magnificent engine coupled to a series of carriages, painted in the railway company's distinctive livery. Steam rose from various points along its length, giving it the appearance of a slumbering dragon preparing to wake. Holmes had secured us a first-class compartment, knowing that the privacy and comfort would be valuable for a journey of several hours' duration. We settled into our seats as the final passengers boarded, and the porters completed their loading of luggage and cargo. The compartment was well appointed, with upholstered seats, a small table by the window, and adequate heating from pipes that ran beneath the floor. Holmes arranged himself in the corner seat, positioning himself where he could observe both the compartment's interior and the view from the window, a strategic choice that had become habit over our years of travelling together. A whistle blew, sharp and clear, cutting through the station's ambient noise, and with a great exhalation of steam and a series of metallic clanks as the carriages took up their connections, the train began to move. Slowly at first, then, with increasing confidence, we slid out of the station and into London's outskirts, beginning our journey northward into the winter landscape. The countryside wore winter's colours, browns and greys, bare trees sketching dark lines against pale skies, fields dormant beneath frost that would not fully melt until the sun climbed higher. Occasional farmhouses appeared, smoke rising from their chimneys, looking warm and inviting against the cold landscape. Small villages clustered around church spires, their streets empty at this hour, their buildings huddled together as though for warmth. The train's motion created its own rhythm, a clickety-clack of wheels over rail, joins that formed a percussion beneath the deeper notes of the engine's working, and the occasional whistle announcing our passage. It was a sound conducive to thought, to the kind of half-sleeping contemplation where the mind drifts but remains loosely tethered to awareness. I found myself slipping into that state, watching the landscape flow past while my thoughts wandered across the details Holmes had shared the previous evening. An elderly man disappearing from a locked house. A scholar of Roman history suddenly interested in sealed wings and old archives. A wife much younger than her husband, a source of family controversy. Children who might have complicated feelings about their father's remarriage and the potential implications for their inheritance. The elements seemed familiar, almost cliché, the sort of domestic drama that could easily explain a voluntary disappearance, or even suggest foul play of the most mundane sort. Yet Holmes had been drawn to the case, which suggested depths I could not yet perceive. I had learned over the years to trust his instincts, to recognize that he often saw connections and possibilities invisible to ordinary perception. If he believed Ravenswood Manor held genuine mystery rather than mere family intrigue, then I would suspend my skepticism and wait for the evidence to reveal itself. The train stopped at several small stations along the route, taking on and discharging passengers, loading mail and cargo, performing all the small tasks necessary to maintain connections between communities. At one such stop, a woman boarded our carriage carrying a basket that emitted the unmistakable smell of fresh bread, and my stomach responded, despite having eaten breakfast not long before. She settled into a seat diagonal from us and produced knitting from somewhere within her voluminous coat, her needles beginning to click in counterpoint to the train's rhythm. Holmes lowered his newspaper and engaged her in conversation with that easy charm he could deploy when it suited his purposes. Within minutes, she had revealed that she was traveling to visit a daughter who had recently given birth, that the bread was her special recipe that her daughter particularly craved, that she made this journey twice monthly and had done so for the past 3 years without fail. Holmes listened with apparent fascination, asked relevant questions, and gradually steered the conversation toward the topic of travellers and unusual journeys, eventually mentioning our own destination, Northumberland. The woman said, her needles pausing. That's wild country up there, especially this time of year. Beautiful, mind you, but wild. My late husband came from those parts, and he always said that winter in Northumberland was a test of character. Have you heard anything of Ravenswood Manor? Holmes asked casually, as though the question were merely polite conversation rather than investigation. The woman's needles resumed their clicking, but her expression had shifted subtly into something more guarded. I've heard the name, she admitted slowly. Old family, keep to themselves mostly. There was some talk a few years back about the old lord remarrying. Chose someone unexpected, but that's his business, isn't it? We all have a right to seek happiness where we find it. Indeed we do, Holmes agreed. And have you heard anything more recent? My companion and I are old friends of the family, and have been out of touch for some time. The woman glanced between us, clearly trying to decide how much to share with strangers, however genteel they might appear. Well, she said finally, her voice dropping to the confidential tone people use when sharing information that might be gossip but might also be important. There was something I heard at the market just 2 days ago. One of the maids from the manor, Ravenswood, employs several girls from the local villages, mentioned that there'd been some upset. She didn't give details, mind, probably couldn't or wouldn't, but she said the house was in a state, and that local police had been tramping about asking questions. How distressing, Holmes murmured sympathetically. I do hope nothing serious has occurred. She didn't say it was serious exactly, the woman replied, but she did say it was strange. Those were her words. Strange goings-on at the manor. Of course, old houses always have their oddities, don't they? Drafts and noises and rooms that people say are haunted, though I've never held with such things myself. Is Ravenswood Manor reputed to be haunted? I asked, unable to resist the question, despite knowing that Holmes likely had little patience for supernatural speculation. The woman's needles clicked several times before she answered. There are stories, but then there are always stories about old families and old houses. Something about a Roman curse, if I remember correctly, though the details escape me. My husband used to say that when people don't understand something, they call it cursed or haunted, when really it's just the past refusing to stay properly buried. A wise observation, Holmes said, and I could hear the genuine appreciation in his voice. The past does have a way of making itself present, especially in places where history runs deep. The conversation drifted to other topics after that. The woman's other children, the changes she'd observed in the country over her lifetime, her opinions on modern railway travel compared to the coaching days of her youth. Holmes listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that seemed motivated by genuine curiosity rather than investigative purpose. When we reached her station, she gathered her basket and knitting, wished us well on our journey, and disembarked with the assistance of a porter who appeared to know her well. Once we were alone in the compartment again, I turned to Holmes with a questioning look. A Roman curse. Every old estate in Britain claims either Roman foundations or a curse related to disturbing sane, Holmes replied, his tone dismissive. It's part of the romantic mythology that families cultivate to make their ancestral homes seem more interesting. However, the detail about Sir Edmund's scholarly interest in Roman settlements gains additional context when we learn that local folklore already associates Ravenswood with Roman occupation. You think he may have discovered something genuine? I asked. Actual Roman remains on the property. I think it's possible that he believed he had discovered something, Holmes clarified. Whether that belief was justified, and whether it bears any relationship to his disappearance, remains to be determined. But the pattern begins to suggest itself. A scholar investigating local history, discovering some possibility or legend related to his own property, becoming consumed by the investigation to the point of altering his established routines, and then vanishing under impossible circumstances. Each element feeds into the next. The train had resumed its northward progress, and the landscape beyond our windows had grown progressively more rugged as we travelled. The gentle farmland of the south was giving way to rougher terrain, hills rising in the distance, stone walls replacing hedgerows, vegetation becoming sparse and wind-sculpted. The sky had lowered as well, clouds thickening into a solid grey ceiling that seemed to press down upon the earth, and I did not doubt that we would encounter rain or possibly snow before our journey concluded. Holmes lapsed back into silence, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, though I suspected he was seeing not the actual landscape, but rather some internal map of possibilities and deductions. I retrieved Mrs. Hudson's package of sandwiches and found them to be, as always, perfectly prepared. Thin sliced ham with a touch of mustard, cucumber cut precisely, bread fresh and soft. I offered one to Holmes, who accepted it with an absent nod and ate mechanically, fuel for the engine of his mind rather than something to be savoured. The afternoon wore on in this fashion, long stretches of contemplative silence broken by occasional observations about the landscape or brief discussions of the case details. Holmes seemed content to let his mind work at its own pace, and I knew better than to push for conclusions before he was ready to articulate them. Outside, the weather deteriorated as we travelled north. First a light misting rain, then a steady drizzle that obscured the more distant views and made the landscape appear as though seen through gauze. We changed trains at York, transferring to a smaller local line that would carry us into Northumberland. The station at York was medieval in parts, its modern additions built around and through older structures, creating an architectural palimpsest that seemed appropriate for a journey concerned with the intersection of past and present. The local train was less grand than the main line, older carriages, simpler appointments, but still comfortable enough for the remaining hours of our journey. As we travelled deeper into Northumberland, the landscape took on a character both beautiful and austere. Hills rose more steeply now, their sides scarred with ancient stone walls that climbed impossible gradients, testimony to centuries of human persistence in shaping the land to agricultural purpose. Sheep dotted the hillsides, their wool thick against the winter cold, appearing as white smudges against the dark vegetation. Bare trees stood in copses and along watercourses, their branches creating intricate patterns against the grey sky. The villages we passed through had a different quality than their southern counterparts, built of local stone in shades of grey and brown. They seemed to grow from the landscape itself, rather than being imposed upon it. Church towers were squat and strong, built to withstand the northern weather, and the houses clustered close together as those seeking mutual protection from the elements. Smoke rose from every chimney, and in the gathering afternoon dimness, windows began to glow with lamplight, creating small beacons of warmth in the cold landscape. Holmes pointed out various features as we travelled, a stretch of Roman wall visible on a distant hillside, a medieval peel tower standing solitary in a field, a river that he identified as one mentioned in the border ballads. His knowledge was comprehensive, drawn from his seemingly inexhaustible mental archive, and I was reminded once again of the breadth of learning he had accumulated and could deploy when relevant to a case. We are entering country where the border between England and Scotland was for centuries a contested space, he observed, his finger tracing an invisible line across the window. The families who survived here had to be strong, cunning, and adaptable. The Ashfords are one of the old border families, with a history stretching back to before the Norman conquest. They've survived Viking raids, Scottish incursions, English civil wars, and all the various upheavals of history by being shrewd enough to choose the winning side, strong enough to defend what was theirs, and flexible enough to adapt when circumstances demanded it. And yet, I observed, their current patriarch has vanished from his own home without apparent explanation, rather undermines the impression of strength and shrewdness, or suggests that he encountered something that even that considerable family legacy could not prepare him for. Holmes countered. Remember, Watson, that the most dangerous mysteries are those that catch even the careful and intelligent off their guard. The train began to slow as we approached our destination, a small market town called Bellingham, which Holmes had identified as the nearest railway station to Ravenswood Manor. The platform was largely empty when we arrived, the hour being late afternoon, and the weather discouraging all but necessary travel. A single porter waited to assist with luggage, and beyond the station's modest building, I could see a carriage with the Ashford crest upon its door, clearly sent to collect us. We gathered our bags and descended from the train, which seemed eager to complete its business and return to more sheltered locations. The air that greeted us was sharply cold, carrying the scent of coal smoke and approaching rain, with an underlying note of vegetation and earth that spoke of the wild country surrounding the town. The light was already beginning to fail, though the sun would not officially set for another hour. Winter in the north being a season more of twilight than true day. The carriage driver was a man of middle years with the weathered face of someone who spent much time outdoors. He greeted us formally, addressing Holmes by name, clearly having been told to expect us. Our luggage was efficiently stowed, and we climbed into the carriage's interior, which was cold but equipped with heavy blankets that we gratefully deployed across our laps. "It's about 5 miles to the manor, sirs," the driver informed us through the small communicating window. "The road's decent enough, though we might see some rain before we arrive. Lady Ashford asked that I bring you directly to the house rather than stopping in the village." "Very good," Holmes acknowledged, and the driver clicked to his horses. The carriage lurched into motion, and we left the town behind, heading into the countryside along a road that wound between stone walls and bare hedgerows. The landscape in this failing light had a stark beauty, rolling hills fading into darkness, the occasional stand of trees creating darker masses against the general grey, distant mountains visible as mere suggestions at the horizon. Stone farmhouses appeared at intervals, their windows glowing warm, smoke rising straight from chimneys in the still air that precedes weather. The road climbed and descended, following the land's contours, and several times we forded small streams that ran swift and dark over their rocky beds. Holmes sat forward, his attention fixed on the passing scenery with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every detail: the arrangement of the landscape, the locations of buildings and landmarks, the character of the terrain. This was habit with him, the instinctive gathering of information that might later prove relevant, the refusal to allow any detail to pass unobserved, simply because its importance was not yet apparent. "Notice the watchtowers," he said, pointing to a ruined structure silhouetted against the darkening sky. This area saw significant border conflict, and the towers served as both refuge and warning system. Many of the local families have such structures on their lands, often incorporated into later buildings. I would not be surprised to learn that Ravenswood Manor contains elements of an original peel tower. A fortress, in essence, I observed. Precisely. These families built for defence as much as comfort, and those priorities shaped the architecture in ways that persist even after the need for defence has long passed. Secret rooms, hidden passages, walls thick enough to withstand siege, all features common to border architecture, and all potentially relevant to understanding how a man might disappear from a locked house. The observation sent a small thrill through me, not of fear, but of anticipation. The sense that we were approaching something genuinely mysterious, and that the next few days would test all of Holmes's considerable skills. The detective seemed to feel it as well, a sharpening of his attention, a coiling of mental energy in preparation for the work ahead. The rain began as we travelled. First a few exploratory drops against the carriage roof, then a steady drumming that intensified the sense of isolation and emphasized the warmth and relative comfort of our conveyance. The windows quickly fogged with moisture, and I wiped a clear spot with my glove to maintain some view of our surroundings, though the gathering darkness and rain made visibility increasingly limited. We turned off the main road onto a private drive marked by stone pillars topped with carved ravens, the family symbol, clearly, and the origin of the estate's name. The drive wound through parkland, past ancient trees that loomed like giants in the rain and dimness, their bare branches creating tangled patterns overhead. The quality of the road improved, well-maintained gravel crunching beneath our wheels, and the landscaping became more evident despite the conditions. Carefully placed groupings of trees, managed vistas now obscured by weather, but clearly designed to impress in better conditions. Then, through the rain, the manor itself appeared. Ravenswood Manor was built of the local grey stone, weathered to a colour that seemed to shift between blue and brown depending on the light. It was substantial without being ostentatious. 3 stories of solid construction with mullioned windows, steep roofs to shed the northern weather, and multiple chimneys from which smoke currently rose. The architecture was indeed, as Holmes had predicted, clearly incorporating an older tower structure around which later additions had been built, creating a building that had grown organically over centuries, rather than being executed to a single design. Light glowed from many of the windows, warm and welcoming against the cold evening, and as we approached, the front door opened, casting a rectangle of golden illumination onto the wet gravel. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the interior light. A woman, from the outline of her dress, waiting to receive us. The carriage drew to a halt before the entrance, and Holmes and I emerged into the rain, which was now falling steadily, though not violently. We hurried up the steps and into the shelter of the doorway, where the waiting woman stepped back to allow us entry into a spacious entrance hall. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice low and melodious, touched with an accent that suggested education had smoothed but not entirely eliminated northern origins. "I am Catherine Ashford. Thank you for coming so quickly." Lady Ashford was indeed young. I estimated her age at perhaps 40, though the strain visible in her face might have aged her beyond her years. She was handsome rather than beautiful, with strong features and dark hair pulled back in a severe but elegant style. Her dress was black, appropriate for mourning, though her husband was missing, rather than confirmed dead, and she carried herself with a dignity that seemed hard-won rather than natural. "Lady Ashford," Holmes said, taking her offered hand and bowing slightly over it. "Please accept our condolences for your distress. I assure you that we will do everything in our power to locate your husband and determine the circumstances of his disappearance." "I cannot tell you what a relief it is to have you here," she replied, and I could hear genuine emotion beneath the formal words. "The local authorities have been well-meaning, but they seem utterly baffled. They've searched the house and grounds repeatedly, questioned the servants, made all sorts of suppositions, but produced no actual results. Edmund is simply gone, and they seem content to wait for him to reappear, or for his body to be discovered, as though those were the only possible outcomes." A servant appeared to take our wet coats and hats, and Lady Ashford gestured toward a corridor leading deeper into the house. "You must be tired from your journey. I've had rooms prepared for you, and dinner will be ready within the hour, unless you wish to begin your investigation immediately." Holmes glanced at me, then back to our hostess. "Perhaps a compromise. If you could show us the library where Sir Edmund was last seen, and answer a few preliminary questions, that would allow us to begin forming our understanding. Then we can refresh ourselves and discuss the matter more fully over dinner." "Of course," Lady Ashford agreed, relief evident in her expression that we were taking immediate action. "The library is this way." She led us through the entrance hall, which I now had opportunity to observe properly. A grand space with a floor of black and white marble tiles, arranged in a pattern that drew the eye toward a magnificent staircase. Portraits lined the walls, presumably Ashford ancestors, gazing down with the stern expressions common to such paintings, rendered in styles ranging from Tudor to modern. A massive fireplace stood cold and dark at one end of the hall, large enough to roast an ox, its mantel carved with intricate designs that included ravens and roses intertwined. We passed through a doorway into a corridor panelled in dark wood, illuminated by gas lamps turned low, their light creating a soft glow that was welcoming without being bright. The corridor was long, with doors opening off it at intervals, and our footsteps were muffled by a runner carpet in a pattern of deep blues and reds. "The library is in the oldest part of the house," Lady Ashford explained as we walked. "It was originally the Great Hall of the Peel Tower, converted to its current purpose about 100 years ago, when the family built the newer wings and no longer needed such a large defensive space." She stopped before a heavy oak door reinforced with iron straps, clearly original to the tower's construction, and pushed it open. The room beyond took my breath away. The library occupied a space perhaps 40 feet square and 20 feet high, with walls lined floor to ceiling with books. A gallery ran around 3 sides of the room at the second floor level, accessible by a wrought iron spiral staircase, providing access to the upper shelves. Windows set deep into the thick stone walls were mullioned and leaded, their glass old enough to show slight wavering, and they looked out onto darkness now, though I imagined they would provide stunning views of the surrounding countryside in daylight. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, currently burning with a substantial fire that filled the room with warmth and the pleasant scent of burning oak. Leather chairs and small tables were arranged in conversational groupings, and a large desk stood before the fireplace, its surface covered with papers, books, and what appeared to be maps. The overall impression was of a space devoted entirely to learning and contemplation, a sanctuary from the world where a scholar could lose himself in research and thought. Edmund spent most of his time in this room, Lady Ashford said softly, her gaze sweeping across the space, with an expression that mingled fondness and sorrow. He always said it was the heart of the house, that all the accumulated knowledge of his family resided here. He knew the location of every book, could find any reference he needed without hesitation. Holmes had already begun his examination, moving through the space with that peculiar gliding walk he adopted when fully engaged in observation. His eyes darted from detail to detail: the desk, the fireplace, the arrangement of furniture, the books on the shelves, the windows and their frames. He paused before the desk, examining the papers spread across its surface without touching them. "This was his current research?" he asked, gesturing to the materials. "Yes," Lady Ashford confirmed. He was working on a paper about Roman signal stations in Northumberland. It was to be his most significant scholarly contribution, he said. He'd been gathering material for over a year. Holmes bent closer to examine the documents, and I joined him, curious about what had consumed Sir Edmund's attention. The papers included maps, both modern Ordnance Survey maps and what appeared to be older charts, hand-drawn and yellowed with age. There were also several books opened to specific pages, their margins filled with notes in a cramped but legible hand. Photographs of archaeological sites were scattered among the papers, along with what appeared to be rubbings taken from stone inscriptions. "These notes," Holmes said, pointing to annotations on one of the older maps, "they mark specific locations on the Ravenswood estate. Do you know what significance these sites held for your husband?" Lady Ashford moved closer to examine the map. "I'm not certain of all of them, but Edmund did mention that he believed there were Roman remains on our property that had never been properly investigated. He thought that one of the hills in our northern parkland might conceal a signal station, and that there might be additional structures or artifacts that could confirm his theory." "And did he investigate these sites physically?" Holmes pressed. "Did he excavate or explore them?" "Not extensively," she replied. "The weather has been poor, and at his age, scrambling about on hillsides was not practical. But he did walk the property more frequently than usual, and he spent considerable time in the older parts of the house, particularly the tower levels and the cellars. He said he was looking for evidence that the house itself might have been built over Roman foundations." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "And did he find such evidence?" Lady Ashford hesitated, her expression uncertain. "I think he may have. The week before he disappeared, he was in particularly good spirits, almost excited, which was unusual for him. Edmund was generally calm, measured in his enthusiasms, but he told me that he'd found something remarkable, something that would change our understanding of the estate's history. In his words, he wouldn't provide details, said he wanted to verify his findings before making any announcements." "Did he share these findings with anyone else?" I asked. "Other scholars, perhaps, or family members?" "Not that I'm aware of," she replied. "Edmund could be quite secretive about his research until he was ready to publish. He'd been disappointed in the past by having ideas stolen or preempted, and so he'd learned to keep his discoveries close until he could establish priority." Holmes had moved to examine the fireplace, running his hands along the stone mantel and the surrounding wall, his fingers probing gaps between the stones with the delicacy of a surgeon. Lady Ashford, you mentioned that your husband went to fetch a specific book on the evening of his disappearance. Do you recall which book that was? She nodded, crossing to one of the shelves and pointing to a gap in an otherwise complete set. It was Volume 3 of Camden's Britannia, the 1607 edition. Edmund had a complete set of the early editions, which he valued highly. He mentioned at dinner that he wanted to verify a reference, and said he would just step to the library to retrieve it. He never returned, and when we came to look for him, the book was still in its place on the shelf. Holmes examined the gap, then the surrounding volumes, finally removing the specified book and paging through it carefully. He paused at several pages, reading closely, before returning the volume to its shelf with evident care. When you came to search for him, Holmes said, turning back to Lady Ashford, how much time had elapsed since he left the dining room? Perhaps 20 minutes, she replied. We'd finished the main course and were waiting for dessert. When Edmund didn't return, I assumed he'd become absorbed in something and lost track of time, which was not uncommon. I sent a servant to fetch him, and when she returned saying the library was empty, I became concerned and came myself. And when you arrived, what exactly did you find? Lady Ashford's face paled slightly at the memory. The room was exactly as you see it now. Fire burning, lamps lit, his research spread across the desk. But no Edmund. We searched the room thoroughly, looked in every corner, even checked behind the furniture. Nothing. It was as though he'd simply evaporated. Holmes walked a slow circuit of the room, his gaze sweeping across every surface. The windows were all secured. Yes, locked from the inside. And even if they hadn't been, we're on the second floor here. The ground drops away steeply on this side of the house. He could never have climbed out without a rope, and there was no rope. The door? Was it locked when you arrived? No, it was closed but not locked. Edmund rarely locked the library door. He said knowledge should be accessible. Holmes nodded, apparently satisfied with this information. He moved to the spiral staircase and ascended to the gallery level, moving along the shelves and examining the windows from that vantage. I could see him testing the window latches, checking the integrity of the walls, searching for any hidden panels or passages that might explain Sir Edmund's disappearance. After several minutes, he descended and stood in the center of the room, slowly rotating to take in the entire space. Lady Ashford, I would like to examine Sir Edmund's bedroom, his study, if he had one separate from the library, and the older sections of the house, the tower levels and cellars you mentioned. But perhaps those investigations can wait until after we've dined, and you've had opportunity to provide us with a more complete account of the days leading up to his disappearance. Of course, she agreed, relief evident that we were not demanding immediate answers she could not provide. Let me show you to your rooms so you can refresh yourselves. Dinner will be served in 45 minutes in the small dining room. I thought that would be more comfortable than the formal hall, given the circumstances. She led us from the library, closing the heavy door behind us with a sound like finality, and conducted us through the house to a wing of guest chambers. My room was spacious and well appointed, with a large four-poster bed, a fireplace already burning cheerfully, and windows that looked out over the darkened parkland. A servant had already unpacked my bag and laid out fresh clothes, and a basin of hot water steamed gently on the washstand. I cleaned away the travel dust and changed into dinner clothes, appreciating the simple comfort of warm water and clean linen. Through the wall, I could hear Holmes moving about in the adjacent room, his footsteps creating a familiar rhythm that was somehow reassuring. When we emerged at the appointed time, Lady Ashford was waiting to guide us to the dining room, and I noticed that she had changed as well, though her dress remained black, a reminder that we were in a house under the shadow of loss. The small dining room was indeed more intimate than a formal space would have been, though it still seated 12 comfortably. The table was set for 3 at one end, creating a conversational arrangement, and the fire here too burned brightly, casting dancing shadows on the panelled walls. A portrait of a stern-looking gentleman in 18th century dress dominated one wall, presumably an Ashford ancestor, judging by the distinctive nose that I would come to recognise as a family trait. We settled into our seats, and servants began bringing in the meal. A hearty country dinner of roasted lamb, winter vegetables, and rich gravy, followed by a fruit compote and cheese. The food was excellent, and I realised I had not eaten properly since our breakfast in London, which now seemed ages past, though it had been only that morning. As we ate, Lady Ashford began to provide a more complete account of the weeks leading up to her husband's disappearance, and Holmes listened with complete attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed connections and implications invisible to me. The narrative that emerged painted a picture of a man becoming increasingly consumed by his research, withdrawing into his scholarly world in a way that, Lady Ashford admitted, had created some tension in their marriage. She had felt excluded from his excitement, hurt that he would not share what he had discovered, and worried that his preoccupation was affecting his health and his relationships with other family members. His son Thomas visited 3 weeks ago, she said, her fingers toying with her wineglass, and Edmund barely spoke to him, so absorbed was he in his work. Thomas left rather hurt, which pained me because their relationship had been strained since our marriage, and I had hoped they were beginning to mend that breach. Did Thomas give any indication of what he and his father discussed during the visit? Holmes asked. The estate, primarily. Thomas is the heir and takes an active interest in the property's management. He and Edmund had some disagreement about proposed improvements. Thomas wants to modernise some of the farming operations, while Edmund felt that the traditional methods had served adequately for generations. It's an old argument between them, one that predates my arrival in the family. Holmes made a mental note of this, filing it away with all the other details he was accumulating. The meal continued, the conversation ranging across various topics: the estate's history, the family relationships, Sir Edmund's scholarly work, and the peculiarities of his behaviour in recent weeks. Lady Ashford spoke with increasing freedom as the evening progressed, clearly finding relief in being able to share her concerns with someone who took them seriously. When the meal concluded, we retired to a sitting room where coffee and brandy had been prepared. The room was cosy, with comfortable furniture arranged before yet another fireplace. The house seemed to have dozens of them, all necessary to combat the northern cold. Rain still fell outside, drumming against the windows, creating a sound that would have been soothing under other circumstances. Lady Ashford, Holmes began, settling into an armchair and cradling his coffee cup. I must ask some questions that may seem impertinent, but I assure you they serve a necessary purpose. Please understand that I ask not out of prurient curiosity, but because any detail, no matter how personal, may prove relevant. She nodded, her expression serious. "I understand, Mr. Holmes. Ask whatever you need to ask." "Your marriage to Sir Edmund, would you characterize it as happy?" Lady Ashford did not answer immediately, clearly considering her response carefully. "I cared for Edmund deeply," she said finally. "He was kind to me, respectful, generous. But was it a love match in the romantic sense? No. I think we both understood that it was a practical arrangement that had the potential to bring us both companionship and contentment. I had been governess to his grandchildren and found myself in that difficult position, occupied by educated women without family fortune, too elevated for service, too poor for society. Edmund offered me security, position, and the opportunity to be mistress of a great estate. I offered him companionship, someone to share his interests in history and learning, and perhaps the hope that his final years would not be lonely. And his children, how did they receive your marriage? With varying degrees of acceptance, she replied, with a slight, sad smile. Eleanor, his daughter, was perhaps the most welcoming. She understood her father's loneliness and genuinely seemed happy that he had found a companion. The younger son, William, was abroad when we married and has remained largely indifferent to the arrangement. But Thomas, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Thomas saw the marriage as an insult to his mother's memory and a potential threat to his inheritance. He made his disapproval quite clear. Has there been any reconciliation since? Some warming, perhaps, but the relationship remains strained. Thomas is a proud man, and he does not forgive easily. Holmes absorbed this information with a slight nod. And what would happen to the estate if Sir Edmund were to be declared dead? It would pass to Thomas under the terms of the entail, Lady Ashford said, meeting Holmes's gaze directly. I would retain a life interest in the dower house and receive an annual income, but the estate itself and the majority of the family wealth would go to the eldest son, as it has done for generations. And if Sir Edmund were merely missing rather than confirmed dead, the situation would be considerably more complicated legally, she admitted. The estate would essentially be in limbo until Edmund could be declared dead after the statutory period, which I believe is 7 years. During that time, management would fall to the trustees, and decisions about the property would be subject to legal review and approval. It was a motive, potentially, though not an obvious one. If Lady Ashford had designs on the family wealth, having her husband disappear rather than die created more problems than it solved. Unless, of course, there were layers to the situation that had not yet been revealed. The conversation continued for another hour, touching on various aspects of the household, the servants, the local community, and Sir Edmund's habits and routines. Holmes extracted every detail with patient questioning, building his understanding of the situation piece by careful piece. Finally, when the fire had burned low and the hour had grown late, he declared that we should all retire and resume our investigation fresh in the morning. Lady Ashford showed us back to our rooms, thanked us again for coming, and withdrew to her own chambers. I found my room pleasantly warm, the fire replenished during dinner, and the bed turned down invitingly. I prepared for sleep, my mind full of the day's revelations and the mystery we had come to solve. Before extinguishing my lamp, I heard a soft knock at the connecting door between Holmes's room and mine. "Come in," I called, and Holmes entered, wearing his dressing gown and carrying a candle. "Not yet asleep, I trust," he said, settling into the room's single chair. "Too much on my mind," I admitted. "What do you make of it all, Holmes?" "I make of it that we are dealing with something considerably more complex than a simple disappearance," he replied. "Sir Edmund discovered something. Of that I'm certain. Something related to Roman occupation of this area. Something concealed within or beneath his own home. That discovery led him to alter his behavior, to spend time in sealed portions of the house, to become secretive and preoccupied. Then, at a moment when he claimed to be fetching a book from his library, he vanished completely from a room that appears to offer no means of undetected exit. You suspect foul play. I suspect nothing yet, but I observe several possibilities. Either Sir Edmund left that library by means we have not yet discovered, or he never actually reached the library in the first place and was intercepted elsewhere. Or he did reach the library, and his disappearance is related to whatever he discovered in his research. Possibly he found a hidden passage or chamber and entered it, meeting with accident or becoming trapped. The third option seems most likely, I offered. Perhaps, though we must not allow likelihood to blind us to other possibilities. Tomorrow, I want to examine the route from the dining room to the library, search the cellars and tower levels, and investigate the locations on Sir Edmund's maps. Somewhere in this house, or on this estate, is the answer to where he went and why. Holmes rose, taking his candle. "Rest well, Watson. Tomorrow promises to be illuminating." He withdrew to his own room, leaving me to my thoughts and the sound of rain against the windows. I extinguished my lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around me, timbers creaking, the wind finding gaps to whistle through, the ever-present whisper of rain. Somewhere in this ancient building, a man had vanished. Somewhere, answers waited to be discovered. I drifted towards sleep, my last conscious thought being that we stood on the threshold of revelation, that the next days would peel back layers of mystery until truth emerged, stark and clear. It was a comforting thought, that trust in Holmes's abilities and in the power of reason to illuminate even the most obscure corners of human experience. Sleep claimed me gently, carrying me into dreams of Roman soldiers and hidden passages, of libraries filled with shadows and secrets waiting centuries to be revealed. Morning came grey and cold, rain still falling in steady sheets that obscured the distant hills and made the parkland appear watercolour soft, all edges blurred and colours muted. I woke to find a servant had already entered my room and built up the fire, and hot water steamed in the basin, ready for my morning ablutions. The simple efficiency of the household staff spoke well of Lady Ashford's management, I reflected, regardless of what other questions might surround her marriage and position. I dressed and descended to find breakfast laid out in a sunny morning room, or what would have been sunny had the weather cooperated. As it was, lamps supplemented the grey daylight, and the room's yellow walls seemed determined to provide cheerfulness in defiance of the conditions outside. Holmes was already present, working his way through toast and coffee, with that absent manner that indicated his mind was elsewhere, likely planning the day's investigations. Lady Ashford joined us shortly, looking as though she had slept poorly, shadows beneath her eyes, and her skin pale against her black dress. She managed a wan smile and joined us for tea, though she ate sparingly, pushing food around her plate more than consuming it. "I thought you might want to begin with the route Edmund would have taken from the dining room to the library," she suggested, "and then I can show you the older sections of the house that he'd been exploring." An excellent plan, Holmes agreed, finishing his coffee and rising from the table with that sudden energy that always marked his transition from rest to action. "Let us begin immediately." We left the morning room and made our way back through the house toward the dining room, where Sir Edmund had last been seen by his wife and servants. The route took us through several corridors, past closed doors that Lady Ashford identified as leading to various reception rooms, studies, and storage chambers. The house was a warren of spaces accumulated over centuries, added as family needs and fashions changed, creating a complex floor plan that would take days to fully comprehend. The dining room, the larger, formal space, rather than the intimate room where we'd eaten the previous evening, was an impressive chamber with a table that could easily seat 20. Walls hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes, and tall windows looking out onto the rain-swept gardens. Holmes examined the room carefully, paying particular attention to the door through which Sir Edmund would have exited. "From here to the library," Holmes mused, standing in the doorway. "What is the most direct route?" Lady Ashford pointed down a corridor. "Along here, turn right at the portrait gallery, and the library door is at the end of that passage, perhaps 2 minutes' walk at Edmund's usual pace." We followed the route she described, Holmes stopping frequently to examine side passages, test doors, inspect the walls and floors for anything unusual. The portrait gallery she had mentioned was a long room lined with paintings of Ashford ancestors, their stern faces watching our progress with painted eyes. Rain drummed against the windows here, the sound magnified by the room's length, creating an almost hypnotic percussion. At the gallery's far end, we entered the corridor leading to the library, and here Holmes's examination became even more intense. He produced his magnifying glass and examined the floor with minute attention, moving slowly along its length in a crouch that must have been uncomfortable, but which allowed him to observe details invisible to normal sight. "What is beneath this corridor?" he asked suddenly, straightening and looking to Lady Ashford. "Cellars, I believe," she replied. "This is one of the older sections of the house, built over the original tower's lower levels. And these cellars, have they been searched since your husband's disappearance?" The police conducted a cursory examination, but the cellars are extensive, and much of the space is used for storage. Old furniture, family documents, wine, centuries of accumulation that hasn't been properly sorted in generations. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "Then I think we should make the cellars our priority. But first, let us complete our examination of this corridor." He continued his detailed inspection, occasionally pointing out details, to me, that I would never have noticed. Slight disturbances in the dust along the walls, marks on the wainscoting that might have been made by something being dragged or carried, subtle variations in the floor surface that suggested repairs or modifications made over the years. To my eyes, the corridor seemed utterly ordinary, but I knew that Holmes was reading it like a text, extracting information from clues too subtle for ordinary perception. We reached the library door, which stood closed as it had the previous evening. Holmes examined the doorframe with particular care, running his fingers along the jamb and studying the lock mechanism with his glass. Then he pushed the door open and stood on the threshold, looking into the room without entering. "Lady Ashford," he said, without turning, "on the evening of your husband's disappearance, Was the library lamp lit when you arrived, or did you light it yourself? She thought for a moment. It was already lit. Edmund must have lit it when he entered, as was his habit. Holmes nodded, apparently satisfied, and entered the library. The room appeared much as it had the previous evening, though morning light, such as it was, now filtered through the mullioned windows, giving the space a different character. The fire had been rebuilt and burned steadily, and the papers on the desk remained exactly as we had seen them, suggesting Lady Ashford had ordered that nothing be disturbed until Holmes had completed his examination. Holmes went directly to the desk and began a systematic review of Sir Edmund's research materials. He examined each document carefully, making occasional notes in a small book he produced from his pocket, asking questions about the maps and their annotations, studying the photographs of archaeological sites with intense concentration. "This location," he said, pointing to a spot on one of the estate maps. "It's marked with a red star and the notation confirmed." "What did your husband confirm there?" Lady Ashford leaned over to examine the map. "I don't know specifically, but I believe that's a hill in our northern parkland where Edmund thought there might be a Roman signal station. He walked there several times in the weeks before his disappearance. And this notation, subsurface anomaly, did he explain what that meant? He said something about the ground-penetrating survey he'd arranged, showing unusual structures beneath the surface. He was quite excited about it, said it confirmed his theories. Holmes made a note of this and continued his examination. He moved to the bookshelves, running his hands along the spines, occasionally removing a volume to examine it more closely. At the section where Camden's Britannia resided, he paused for a considerable time, removing not just the volume Sir Edmund had supposedly come to fetch, but also the surrounding books, examining each carefully before replacing it. "These books," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "They show signs of frequent use, but not recent, except..." He removed one volume from the shelf below the Camden set, a slender book bound in cracked leather. "This has been handled recently and repeatedly. See how the dust pattern differs from the surrounding volumes." He opened the book and studied its title page. A Historia of the Ancient Families of the North Countries, published in 1643, a family history essentially, documenting the lineage and properties of the border families. He paged through it carefully, pausing when he found a page marked with a slip of paper. And here we have a passage marked by Sir Edmund. Listen to this. "The Ashford lands, held by that family since time immemorial, are said to rest upon foundations more ancient than any Christian erection. The Romans, in their occupation of these northern territories, did establish strongholds and stations of signalling, and some do say that beneath the current manor house lies such a structure, sealed and forgotten when the barbarians did depart our shores. Tales persist among the local peoples of tunnels and chambers hidden beneath the hill, though none living have seen such things, and the family denies knowledge of same." Holmes looked up from the book, his expression one of barely contained excitement. "Your husband found this passage and used it to guide his research. He believed the house itself was built over Roman remains, and he was searching for evidence of those structures." "Searching where?" Lady Ashford asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Surely, if there were tunnels or chambers beneath the house, the family would know of them." "Would they?" Holmes countered. "This house has stood for centuries, been modified and expanded by successive generations, each making changes according to their needs and knowledge. If the original Peel Tower was built over Roman foundations, and if those foundations included chambers or passages that were already ancient and sealed when the tower was constructed, then knowledge of them could easily have been lost over the generations. They would exist as rumours, as family legends, but not as documented fact. He returned the book to its shelf with evident care and turned to face us fully. I believe Sir Edmund found evidence that such chambers existed. I believe he discovered a way to access them, and I believe that on the evening of his disappearance, he did not come to this library to fetch a book at all. He used that as an excuse to leave the dining room, because he had found the entrance to those hidden spaces and could not resist exploring them immediately. Then he could be trapped somewhere in the house, I exclaimed, horrified at the thought of an elderly man injured or imprisoned in darkness for nearly a week. It's possible, Holmes acknowledged, his expression grave. Which is why we must search the cellars and lower levels immediately and thoroughly. Lady Ashford, I will need servants who can assist with moving stored items, adequate lighting, and someone who knows the layout of those spaces as well as anyone does. I'll arrange it at once, she said, already moving toward the door. Give me 15 minutes to assemble what you need. After she left, Holmes turned to me with an expression of grim determination. Watson, we are racing against time. If Sir Edmund is alive but trapped, he has been without food or water for 5 days. The human body can survive such deprivation for a limited period, but at his age and in winter conditions, the margin for survival grows narrower with each passing hour. Then let us hope we find him quickly, I said, feeling my own pulse quicken with urgency. The mystery had suddenly transformed from an intellectual puzzle into a potential race against death, and the change sharpened every sense, made every moment seem weighted with consequence. We descended to the ground floor and then lower still, following a servant into the cellars beneath the house. The temperature dropped noticeably as we went down, and the air grew damp, carrying the musty scent of earth and old stone. The passages here were narrow, with low ceilings that forced even me to duck occasionally, though Holmes's greater height made him bend almost double in places. Lady Ashford had assembled 3 strong footmen to assist us, each equipped with lamps, and we began a systematic search of the warren of spaces beneath Ravenswood Manor. The cellars were extensive, as Lady Ashford had warned, stretching beneath not just the main house, but also the older tower sections. Some areas were clearly still in regular use. Wine storage, root vegetables kept cool for the winter, preserved foods in sealed jars. But other sections appeared not to have been entered in years, their doorways draped with cobwebs, their contents shrouded in dust. We moved through storage rooms filled with broken furniture awaiting repair that would likely never come, through chambers lined with shelves, holding decades of household accounts and estate records, through what had clearly once been servants' quarters, now used for storing trunks and crates whose contents had been forgotten by the living. Holmes examined every space with meticulous care, paying particular attention to the walls, testing the stone for hollow spaces, looking for any indication of passages or chambers sealed behind the visible surfaces. The search was slow, painstaking work, and as the hours passed, I began to fear we would find nothing, that my friend's brilliant deduction had been wrong, and Sir Edmund had disappeared by some other means entirely. Then, in a cellar room beneath what Holmes determined was directly under the library, we found something unusual. The room itself appeared to be used for storing firewood, with cords of split logs stacked against the walls. But Holmes noticed that one section of stacking was different from the others. The wood was arranged more loosely, without the tight packing that characterized the rest, and the dust on the floor before that section showed disturbances, marks suggesting the wood had been moved recently and repeatedly. "Help me remove this wood," Holmes directed the footman, and they set to work, lifting and stacking the logs to one side. Within minutes, they had exposed the wall behind, and what we saw there sent a thrill through me. The wall at this point was different from the surrounding stone, where the rest of the cellar showed the relatively regular masonry of the Peel Tower's construction. Here, the stones were much older, rougher, and laid in a pattern that spoke of Roman engineering. And in the center of this ancient section was something that had clearly been revealed recently, an opening, perhaps 3 feet square, that led into darkness beyond. Holmes immediately produced a lantern and thrust it into the opening, but the light revealed only a narrow passage leading downward at a steep angle, disappearing into blackness beyond the lamp's reach. "Sir Edmund?" Holmes called into the passage, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Sir Edmund Ashford, can you hear me?" We waited in the tense silence, but no response came, save the echo of Holmes's own voice, returning fainter and distorted. "I'm going in," Holmes declared, already removing his coat. "Watson, you'll follow with a second lamp. Lady Ashford, please have your men fetch rope, at least 100 feet, and prepare to establish a relay for passing messages or materials. We don't know what we'll find, and I want to ensure we can communicate with the surface." "Mr. Holmes, surely you should wait for more preparation," Lady Ashford protested. "That passage could be unstable, dangerous." "Which is precisely why we cannot delay," Holmes interrupted, though not unkindly. "If Sir Edmund is down there, alive or dead, we must know immediately. Caution is wise, but not at the cost of a man's life." He was already entering the passage, moving feet first into the narrow opening, his lamp held before him. I followed quickly, my own heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. The passage was cramped, forcing us to crawl, and the stone beneath my hands was cold and slightly damp, textured with the chisel marks of Roman engineers working nearly 2,000 years ago. The passage descended at an angle that made progress awkward, and the air grew progressively colder and more stale as we moved deeper. My lamp cast wild shadows on the walls, and I could hear Holmes ahead of me, his breathing steady, despite the physical exertion and the close confinement. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the passage leveled out and widened slightly. Holmes stopped, and I heard his sharp intake of breath. "Remarkable," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Watson, you must see this." I crawled forward until I was beside him, and raised my lamp to illuminate what lay ahead. We had emerged into a chamber, a room carved from the living rock, its walls showing the unmistakable precision of Roman construction. The space was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with a vaulted ceiling that rose to a height of about 8 feet at its center. The walls were lined with niches containing objects whose purpose I could only guess: pottery vessels, tools corroded by time, fragments of what might have been weapons or armor. But the most remarkable feature of the chamber was at its centre. Here stood a stone altar or table, its surface carved with inscriptions in Latin, and upon this table lay a figure, motionless and still. "Sir Edmund," I cried, scrambling forward, my medical training overriding all other considerations. But as I reached the figure and my lamplight fell upon it fully, I realized my mistake. This was not Sir Edmund Ashford, alive or dead. This was a body, yes, but one that had lain here far longer than 5 days. The figure was wrapped in rotted cloth that might once have been a cloak or shroud, and what remained of the face showed the mummified features of someone dead for centuries, preserved by the chamber's cool, dry conditions. In one skeletal hand, the figure clutched something that gleamed in the lamplight, a small object of tarnished metal. Holmes was already beside the stone table, examining the figure with clinical detachment. A Roman officer, I should judge from the remains of his equipment, and this chamber, it was a shrine or a tomb, carefully sealed and forgotten. "But where is Sir Edmund?" I asked, looking around the chamber with increasing desperation. If he found this place, he should be here. Holmes didn't answer immediately, his lamp moving in slow arcs to illuminate every corner of the chamber. Then, the light found something I had not initially noticed, another opening in the far wall, partially concealed by a fall of rock that appeared to be recent. "There," Holmes said, moving toward it. "The chamber has been damaged, perhaps by Sir Edmund's entry, disturbing stones that had remained stable for centuries. That collapse could have opened another passage or sealed Sir Edmund beyond." We approached the rock fall carefully, Holmes examining it with professional scrutiny. "This stone fell within the last few days," he declared, pointing to fresh breaks and the absence of dust on the exposed surfaces. "Sir Edmund may have been on the other side when it came down." "Can we move it?" I asked, already beginning to pull at the smaller rocks. "Carefully," Holmes cautioned. "The wrong movement could bring down more material and seal this passage entirely. We need the men from above, tools, systematic removal. Watson, go back and fetch them while I continue examining this chamber, and bring more rope. We may need to rig supports." I didn't want to leave, but Holmes's logic was unassailable. I crawled back through the passage, moving as quickly as the cramped space allowed, my mind racing with possibilities. Had we found Sir Edmund's tomb, as well as that of a Roman soldier dead 2 millennia? Or was the old scholar alive somewhere beyond that rockfall, waiting for rescue? I emerged into the cellar to find Lady Ashford pacing anxiously, her face brightening with hope when she saw me. "Have you found him?" she demanded. "We've found a Roman burial chamber," I reported, "and evidence that Sir Edmund discovered it, and may have gone further, before a rockfall sealed the passage. We need men, tools, rope, everything available to clear the obstruction and continue the search." Lady Ashford immediately took charge, dispatching servants for equipment and summoning additional estate workers who could assist. Within 20 minutes, we'd assembled a team and the necessary materials, and I led them back through the passage to where Holmes waited. The next several hours were spent in careful, methodical work, removing stones from the collapse, shoring up the passage with timbers brought from above, gradually creating an opening large enough to pass through. Holmes supervised every movement, ensuring that haste did not compromise safety. His knowledge of engineering and physics, which he had applied to so many criminal investigations, now served to prevent disaster as we literally excavated our way into the unknown. Finally, as afternoon faded toward evening above us, though in this underground darkness, time seemed to have lost all meaning, we cleared an opening sufficient for a man to crawl through. Holmes immediately thrust his lamp into the gap and peered beyond. "There's another chamber," he called back to us, "larger than the first. And Watson, I can see footprints in the dust, recent ones. Sir Edmund came this way." Hope surged through me, and I watched impatiently as Holmes squeezed through the opening, then followed him as quickly as I could manage. The second chamber was indeed larger, a natural cave that had been modified and expanded by Roman engineers, its walls showing both the rough texture of natural stone and the smooth surfaces where tools had shaped the rock to purpose. And there, in the far corner of the chamber, illuminated by the wavering light of our lamps, we found Sir Edmund Ashford. He lay on his side, his eyes closed, his breathing so shallow as to be almost imperceptible. His face was gaunt, his skin pale as parchment, but he was alive. I rushed to his side, my medical training taking full control of my actions. His pulse was weak but present, his body temperature dangerously low, signs of severe dehydration evident. But he lived, and where there was life, there was hope. "We need to get him warm and get fluids into him immediately," I directed, already removing my coat to wrap around him. "Gently now, no sudden movements. His body has been shutting down to conserve energy, and we must coax it back to function carefully." Holmes had already called back through the passage for blankets, warm water, and brandy. As we waited for these items to be passed through, I examined Sir Edmund more thoroughly. Beyond the dehydration and hypothermia, I could find no serious injuries, no broken bones, no sign of violence. He had apparently collapsed here from exposure and starvation, but had suffered no trauma that would prevent recovery if we could reverse his condition sufficiently. The blankets arrived, and we wrapped him carefully, creating warmth around his body. I managed to get a few drops of water between his lips, and to my immense relief, his throat reflex worked to swallow them. More water, drop by drop, patient and persistent. After perhaps 20 minutes of this care, Sir Edmund's eyes flickered open. They were unfocused at first, wandering without comprehension, but gradually awareness returned to them. His gaze found Holmes's face, then mine, and something like recognition dawned. "Found it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Found them all. The chamber, the inscription. Changes everything. Rest now," I urged him gently. "You're safe. We're taking you back to the house." But his hand gripped my arm with surprising strength. "No, you must understand. The inscription, it proves Roman occupation extended, deeper than we thought, organized resistance, hidden here for nearly 2,000 years. His voice faded, his strength exhausted by even that brief speech. But his eyes remained open, lucid, and I could see in them the fire of scholarly excitement that had driven him into this dangerous exploration. "We'll discuss it all when you're recovered," Holmes assured him. "For now, let us focus on getting you back to warmth and safety." The process of extracting Sir Edmund from the chambers was slow and delicate. We fashioned a sling from ropes and blankets, securing him carefully, and then began the arduous process of passing him back through the passages we had navigated. It required the coordinated effort of all the men present, with those in the chambers pushing, those in the passages guiding, and those in the cellar pulling. all working in careful synchronization to avoid injuring our patient. When we finally emerged into the cellar, Lady Ashford was waiting, her face a portrait of conflicting emotions. Relief that her husband was found alive, horror at his condition, anxiety about his recovery. But she maintained her composure, immediately taking charge of practical matters, directing servants to prepare Sir Edmund's chamber, summoning the local physician, arranging for hot broth and warm blankets, and all the necessities of nursing a man back from the edge of death. We carried Sir Edmund up to his bedroom, a spacious chamber in the main house with a massive fireplace that was immediately stoked to blazing. I supervised his placement in bed, ensured he was properly warmed and positioned, and continued my administration of small amounts of water and broth. His colour began to improve almost immediately, the warmth and fluids having their necessary effect. The local physician arrived within the hour, a capable man named Dr. Morrison, who immediately confirmed my assessment and approved my treatment. Together, we established a regime of care designed to restore Sir Edmund's strength gradually without shocking his depleted system. Dr. Morrison agreed to remain at the manor overnight, and between us, we felt confident that Sir Edmund would survive his ordeal, though complete recovery would require days or possibly weeks. Lady Ashford had remained by her husband's side throughout, holding his hand, speaking softly to him, her earlier coolness transformed into genuine concern and affection. Whatever the nature of their marriage, whatever pragmatic considerations had gone into its formation, she clearly cared for him, and he for her. When his eyes opened, they sought her face, and his fingers tightened on hers with unmistakable feeling. As evening drew in and Sir Edmund drifted into a more natural sleep under Dr. Morrison's watchful eye, Holmes and I withdrew to allow the patient rest. We made our way to the library, where a fire had been lit and tea prepared, and collapsed into chairs with the exhaustion that follows sustained physical effort and emotional tension. "Well, Watson," Holmes said after a long silence. "Not quite the mystery we expected when we boarded the train this morning. But a successful resolution nonetheless," I replied. "We found him alive, which seemed increasingly unlikely as the hours passed. Indeed, and we have solved the mystery of his disappearance. He discovered access to Roman chambers beneath his home, became so consumed by the significance of his find that he could not resist exploring them immediately, and was trapped when the rockfall sealed him beyond. A case of scholarly enthusiasm overwhelming prudent caution." "What of his discoveries, though?" I asked. He seemed convinced he had found something of genuine historical importance. Holmes smiled. "Oh, I have no doubt he has. Those chambers are authentic Roman construction, and the burial we discovered, along with whatever inscriptions and artifacts Sir Edmund found in the second chamber, will likely require years of careful study by qualified archaeologists. Sir Edmund has indeed made a remarkable discovery, one that will secure his reputation and perhaps rewrite aspects of Romano-British history, at nearly the cost of his life. A price many scholars would consider worth paying," Holmes observed dryly. "The pursuit of knowledge has claimed many lives throughout history, Watson. Sir Edmund is fortunate that his particular pursuit, while dangerous, proved survivable." We sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the fire and allowing the day's tensions to drain from our bodies. The rain had finally stopped, I realized, and through the library windows, I could see stars beginning to appear in breaks between the clouds, sharp and cold in the winter sky. "You know," I said reflectively, "when Lady Ashford's telegram mentioned most peculiar circumstances, I expected something more sinister. Family intrigue, perhaps, or even foul play. The human tendency is always to suspect human agency in unexplained events," Holmes replied. "We create elaborate theories of conspiracy and malice, when often the truth is simpler. A man's curiosity led him into danger, and chance nearly killed him. Not every mystery involves a villain, Watson, though I confess those cases are generally more interesting from an investigative standpoint. Still, the discovery itself is remarkable. To think that beneath this house, unknown to its inhabitants, lay chambers sealed since Roman times, containing who knows what historical treasures. And serving as a reminder," Holmes added, "that the past is never truly past. It exists beneath our feet, within our walls, in layers waiting to be uncovered. Sir Edmund understood that, and his understanding led him to revelation, albeit nearly at the cost of everything." A servant entered to announce that dinner was ready whenever we wished to eat, and we realized that we had consumed nothing since breakfast. The day's exertions had left us ravenous, and we made our way to the dining room where a meal had been prepared. Lady Ashford did not join us, choosing to remain with her husband, but she sent word that he continued to improve, and that Dr. Morrison was cautiously optimistic about his full recovery. As we ate, Holmes laid out his deductions about exactly what had transpired. Sir Edmund, following the leads in his research, had discovered the sealed passage in the cellar, concealed behind firewood that had likely been stacked there precisely to hide it after some previous discovery or rumour. He had opened the passage and explored it, finding the first chamber with its Roman burial. But scholarly excitement had driven him deeper, through into the second chamber, and while he was there, his disturbance of centuries-old stability had triggered the rockfall that sealed him in. He had probably realized immediately the danger he was in, but the chamber offered no other exit, and his calls for help would not have been heard through so much stone. Trapped, he had done what any scholar would do. He had continued his research, examining and documenting what he found, using the materials he had brought with him to make notes and sketches. Only when his lamp finally exhausted its oil did the true desperation of his situation become clear. And by then, he was already weakening from lack of food and water. He likely survived as long as he did because of the chamber's cold temperature, I observed, my medical knowledge informing the assessment. It slowed his metabolism, reduced his body's demands. In warmer conditions, he would have succumbed to dehydration much sooner. An ironic salvation, Holmes agreed. The very conditions that made his imprisonment miserable also preserved his life long enough for us to find him. We finished our meal and returned to the library, both too energized by the day's events to consider sleep despite our exhaustion. Holmes retrieved the research materials from Sir Edmund's desk and began examining them with fresh understanding, now able to connect the theoretical knowledge in the documents with the actual discovery we had witnessed. "Look at this," he said, showing me one of the inscriptions Sir Edmund had copied from the chambers. It's a roster of Roman soldiers stationed at this location, along with dates that correspond to the late 4th century, near the end of Roman occupation. And here, he indicated another document, a reference to treasures secured against the barbarian hordes. Sir Edmund believed the chambers were used as a refuge and repository when the Roman legions withdrew, a place where soldiers or civilians could hide valuables and possibly themselves during the chaotic period of retreat. So the body we found was likely one of those refugees, possibly a soldier tasked with guarding the hidden treasures who was himself trapped when the entrance was sealed, either by design or by the same kind of rockfall that nearly claimed Sir Edmund. He remained at his post, in a sense, for nearly 2,000 years. It was a sobering thought, that dedication to duty across such an expanse of time. The Roman soldier and Sir Edmund, separated by millennia, both trapped by their commitment to something larger than themselves, one to his empire and military duty, the other to knowledge and historical truth. We talked long into the evening, discussing the historical implications of the discovery, speculating about what else the chambers might reveal when properly excavated, and reflecting on the strange circuitousness of fate that had brought us to this ancient estate, to solve a mystery that proved to be not about crime or malice, but about the persistence of the past into the present. Eventually, exhaustion claimed its due, and we retired to our respective chambers. I fell asleep almost immediately, my dreams a confused mixture of Roman soldiers and narrow passages, of lamplight on ancient stone and the sound of rock falling in darkness. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Sir Edmund continued his recovery, gradually regaining strength until he was able to sit up and speak coherently for extended periods. His first substantial conversation was not with his wife or his physician, but with Holmes, and it concerned not his ordeal, but his discoveries. The two men spent hours in Sir Edmund's chamber discussing the chambers, the artifacts, and the historical implications, Holmes asking precise questions, and Sir Edmund answering with growing excitement as his strength permitted. From these conversations emerged a more complete picture of what Sir Edmund had found. The second chamber contained not just one body, but three, along with several wooden chests that contained various items: coins, jewellery, weapons, documents, preserved by the dry conditions. The inscriptions on the chamber walls detailed the final days of Roman occupation, the retreat of the legions, and the decision by a small group to remain behind, protecting treasures and knowledge that they could not carry in flight. Sir Edmund had documented everything he found before his lamp died, working with fevered intensity, knowing that he might not survive, but determined that his discovery should not die with him. Those notes, written on paper he had brought for the purpose, were still in his pockets when we found him, slightly damp from his body's moisture, but largely legible. They would form the basis for the scholarly papers that would eventually establish his reputation as one of the foremost experts on Romano-British history. Archaeologists were summoned from universities in Edinburgh and London, and they arrived with equipment and expertise to properly excavate and document the chambers. Holmes and I remained at Ravenswood for several more days, partly to ensure Sir Edmund's continued recovery, but also because the investigation of the chambers held genuine fascination. I accompanied one of the archaeological teams into the chambers, this time properly equipped with adequate lighting and safety measures. Seeing the spaces under better conditions, I was struck by their significance. Here was a direct connection to the Roman past, preserved in remarkable condition, offering insights into the final days of occupation that no textual source could provide. The bodies were treated with reverence, the artifacts documented and carefully removed, the inscriptions photographed and translated. One inscription in particular resonated with me. Written in elegant Latin on the wall of the second chamber, it read, "Here we wait in darkness for a dawn that may never come, faithful to our trust, guardians of what was and what might yet be." The Roman soldiers had believed themselves to be preserving their civilization against temporary chaos, expecting that Roman order would eventually return. They could not have known that they waited for a restoration that would never arrive, that the world they knew had ended forever. Yet they had maintained their vigil, and in doing so had left a gift to the future, knowledge of their time, preserved across centuries, waiting for someone like Sir Edmund Ashford to discover and share it. As Sir Edmund's recovery progressed, the family dynamics began to reveal themselves more clearly. Thomas Ashford arrived from his own estate, clearly relieved that his father had been found alive, but also visibly uncomfortable with the attention and publicity the discovery was generating. The relationship between Thomas and Lady Catherine remained strained, though both made efforts toward civility for Sir Edmund's sake. Eleanor, the daughter, proved to be a warm and genuine person who seemed to hold no resentment about her father's remarriage, and who was simply grateful that he had survived. She spent hours at his bedside, listening to his stories of the discovery, and I could see the bond between them, a shared love of history and learning that transcended the usual Victorian distance between fathers and daughters. William, the youngest son, sent telegrams from Constantinople expressing relief and requesting regular updates, but did not return, his diplomatic duties making immediate travel impossible. From the tone of his communications, he seemed the most detached of the children, his life having moved beyond the orbit of the family estate into a wider world. Throughout it all, Lady Catherine maintained a quiet dignity, caring for her husband, managing the household, and dealing with the sudden influx of scholars and journalists with grace despite the obvious strain. I revised my initial impression of her as someone who had married for position and security. While those factors had surely played a role, her genuine affection for Sir Edmund was evident, and her relief at his recovery unfeigned. Holmes spent considerable time interviewing the household staff, not because he suspected any wrongdoing, but because he was curious about the domestic rhythms of the estate, and how Sir Edmund's research had appeared to those who served him daily. The picture that emerged was of a kind, if somewhat distracted employer, a man who treated his servants with courtesy, remembered their names and families, but who also could become so absorbed in his work that he forgot meals or appointments. The staff had noticed his increasing preoccupation in the weeks before his disappearance, but had attributed it to his usual scholarly intensity. The governess, who had been Catherine before her marriage, had apparently been well liked by the staff, and her elevation to Lady of the Manor had been greeted with more approval than might have been expected. She knew the household, understood its operations, and treated those who had formerly been her colleagues with respect. On our final evening at Ravenswood, Sir Edmund was well enough to join us for dinner in his chamber, a quiet meal of 4, with Lady Catherine, Holmes, myself, and the recovering master of the house. Sir Edmund was still weak, his voice sometimes failing, but his mind was sharp, and his spirits remarkably high for someone who had so recently faced death. "Mr. Holmes," he said as we finished the main course, "I owe you and Dr. Watson my life. The local authorities would never have thought to search so thoroughly, would never have found those chambers. I would have died in the dark, and my discovery with me." "You owe us nothing," Holmes replied. The mystery presented itself, and we applied logic and observation to solve it. That you survived is due to your own constitution and Dr. Watson's medical expertise as much as to our investigative efforts. Nevertheless, I am in your debt, Sir Edmund insisted, and I am in your debt as well for what you've helped preserve. Those chambers, those artifacts, they represent a window into a crucial period of our history. The knowledge they contain will inform scholarship for generations. Your own notes and research made that possible, Holmes pointed out. Even trapped and dying, you continued to document what you found, ensuring that your discovery would not be lost. That dedication to knowledge beyond self-preservation is remarkable. Sir Edmund smiled, a slight flush of colour touching his pale cheeks. I suppose I am a foolish old man who nearly killed himself chasing dusty histories. But I regret nothing. What I found was worth the risk. To touch objects held by Roman hands, to read words written in the twilight of their empire, to stand in spaces they carved from living rock. It was transcendent. And nearly terminal, Lady Catherine added, with affection rather than reproach. Promise me, Edmund, that any future archaeological investigations will be conducted with proper safety measures and in daylight, with assistance and equipment. I promise, he assured her, taking her hand. I have learned that valor without discretion is merely foolishness, and I am too old for such foolishness now. The conversation drifted to other topics. The scholarly papers Sir Edmund would write, the proper preservation and display of the artifacts, the possibility that other chambers might yet be discovered on the estate. Holmes contributed his observations about Roman military practice and architecture, drawing on his extensive knowledge to provide context for the discoveries. As the evening drew toward a close, Sir Edmund grew visibly tired, and Lady Catherine suggested he should rest. We took our leave, but at the door, Sir Edmund called Holmes back. "A moment, if you would," he requested, and Holmes returned to his bedside. I waited in the corridor with Lady Catherine, giving them privacy for whatever final words Sir Edmund wished to share. When Holmes emerged several minutes later, he carried a small object wrapped in cloth. He said nothing about it until we had returned to the library, our customary retreat during our stay at Ravenswood. Only then did he unwrap the object and show it to me. It was the metal item I had seen clutched in the hand of the Roman soldier in the first chamber. A small figure of a raven, wrought in bronze, its eyes set with some dark stone that gleamed in the firelight. Age had darkened and pitted the metal, but the craftsmanship was exquisite, each feather delineated, the bird captured in a pose of alert watchfulness. Sir Edmund insisted I take it, Holmes explained. He said the raven was clearly important to the Romans who occupied this site. It appears in several of the inscriptions and decorations. But it's also the symbol of the Ashford family, adopted centuries before anyone knew Romans had been here. He believes the medieval Ashfords may have found some hint of the Roman occupation, perhaps discovered and then lost access to the chambers, and adopted the raven symbol because of its association with the site. The continuity between ancient and modern pleased him, and he wanted me to have this as a reminder that some truths persist across time, waiting to be rediscovered. Holmes turned the figure in his hands, examining it from all angles with evident appreciation. It's a remarkable gift, and one I shall treasure, not for its material value, which is likely modest, but for what it represents, the dedication to truth that nearly cost Sir Edmund his life, but which ultimately revealed something genuinely important. "You'll keep it at Baker Street?" I asked. "I shall," he confirmed. "On the mantelpiece, perhaps, where I can see it during those long winter evenings when the work grows tedious, a reminder that not all mysteries involve crime, that the most profound discoveries sometimes lie not in human malice, but in human history, and that the past is never truly dead. It merely waits, patient as stone, for someone with sufficient curiosity and courage to bring it back into the light." We sat in silence for a time, watching the fire burn low, both lost in our own reflections. Outside, the winter night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black sky, the landscape peaceful under frost that glittered in the moonlight like scattered diamonds. Tomorrow we would return to London, to Baker Street, and the familiar rhythms of our life there. Cases would come and go, criminals would be pursued and captured, mysteries would be solved through the application of Holmes's remarkable gifts. But this case, this strange journey into history disguised as a disappearance, would remain unique in our shared experience, a reminder that the world holds wonders beyond the human dramas we usually investigated, that time layers meaning upon meaning, and that the patient pursuit of truth can reveal treasures that have waited centuries for the right moment and the right minds to appreciate them. "We should retire," I said eventually, noting the late hour. "Our train leaves early, and Mrs. Hudson will scold us if we arrive back looking too worn." Holmes smiled at this image of our landlady's maternal fussing. "Indeed, though I suspect she'll be pleased to have us back, regardless of our appearance. Baker Street has gone untenanted for several days, which likely worries her, despite the telegram I sent, assuring her of our safety." We made our way to our chambers, the house quiet around us, its inhabitants sleeping peacefully, now that their master had been restored to them. I prepared for bed with the satisfaction that comes from work well done, from a life saved and a mystery solved, and with the pleasant anticipation of returning home to the familiar comforts of our London lodgings. But before sleep claimed me, I lay in the darkness and thought about those Roman soldiers, waiting in their chambers for a dawn that never came, faithful to a trust across the vast emptiness of centuries. They had failed in their immediate purpose. The treasures they guarded did not return to Roman hands. The empire they served did not resurrect itself. Yet, in a larger sense, they had succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. Their vigil had preserved something precious, and their dedication had created a gift for the future that we, nearly 2,000 years later, had been privileged to receive. There was something peaceful in that thought, something that spoke to the persistence of human endeavor across time, the way that actions taken in one era could resonate in another, creating connections across the apparently unbridgeable gulf of centuries. The Romans had created, the Ashfords had preserved, without knowing what they preserved, and Holmes and I had been instruments of revelation. As I drifted towards sleep, I imagined those ancient soldiers settling into their watch, confident that their duty mattered, that their vigilance served something larger than themselves. And I thought how Holmes and I, in our own way, performed a similar service, standing watch against disorder, maintaining faith in reason and justice, trusting that our efforts mattered even when immediate results were unclear. The comparison was perhaps grandiose, yet it comforted me. We all serve something, whether we acknowledge it consciously or not. The Romans served their empire, Sir Edmund his pursuit of knowledge, Holmes his dedication to truth and justice, and I served friendship, perhaps, and the simple satisfaction of being useful, of applying my skills in service to something beyond mere existence. Sleep came gently, carrying me into dreams of lamplight on ancient stone, of discoveries waiting in darkness, of the patient persistence of truth across all the barriers time and chance can erect against it. The return journey to London had a different quality than our northward travel. We carried with us the satisfaction of resolution, the knowledge that Sir Edmund would recover and his discoveries would enrich human understanding of the past. The countryside that had seemed forbidding in winter rain now appeared peaceful, even beautiful in weak winter sunlight, and the train's rhythm was soothing rather than monotonous. Holmes spent much of the journey in contemplative silence, occasionally examining the bronze raven he had carefully packed in his luggage, turning it over in his long fingers as though its surface might reveal additional secrets. I occupied myself with writing notes about the case, knowing that I would want to document this unusual investigation for my records, though I suspected it would never be published. The details were too specific, the family too easily identifiable, and the discovery too important to be reduced to popular entertainment. We arrived at King's Cross in late afternoon, the city welcoming us back with its familiar cacophony of sound and motion after Northumberland's relative quiet. A hansom cab carried us back to Baker Street, and we climbed the familiar 17 steps to our rooms with the pleasure that comes from returning home after absence. Mrs. Hudson had indeed worried during our absence, though she tried to disguise her relief at our return with brisk efficiency, bustling about to prepare tea and ensure our rooms were properly warmed. But I caught her expression when we first entered, relief and affection quickly masked by her customary reserve, and knew that Holmes was right about her maternal concern for her unusual tenants. As we settled back into our accustomed places, Holmes in his chair, me in mine, the fire crackling, tea steaming, all the familiar comforts restored, I reflected on how strange it was that such a specific arrangement of elements could constitute home. Not the physical space itself, though that mattered, but the combination of place and routine and companionship that transformed simple rooms into a sanctuary. "It's good to be back," I observed, and Holmes nodded his agreement without speaking, already packing his pipe with his particular blend of tobacco, resuming the rhythms of our London life. The bronze raven found its place on the mantelpiece, as Holmes had promised, positioned where the gaslight would catch it during our evening hours. It looked strange there initially, this ancient artifact among the Victorian clutter of our rooms, but within days it seemed to have always been there, just another element in the familiar landscape of 221B Baker Street. Cases came, as they always did, a matter of forged documents for a nervous banker, a missing heirloom for an elderly widow, a blackmail scheme Holmes unravelled with particular satisfaction. The routine of investigation and resolution resumed, and Ravenswood Manor receded into memory, though it remained vivid in both our minds. I received letters occasionally from Lady Catherine, updating me on Sir Edmund's recovery and the progress of the archaeological investigations. His health returned gradually, though he never regained quite the strength he'd had before his ordeal. But his mind remained sharp, and the papers he published about the chambers generated considerable excitement in scholarly circles, establishing him as the authority he had always hoped to become. The chambers themselves yielded treasures beyond the initial discovery. Documents that shed light on the final years of Roman Britain, artifacts that illustrated daily life during that turbulent period, and inscriptions that named individuals otherwise lost to history. Sir Edmund had indeed made a discovery of genuine importance, and the price he nearly paid for it served to emphasize its value. One evening, perhaps 3 months after our return, as Holmes and I sat in our customary positions, he suddenly spoke without preamble, breaking a comfortable silence. "Do you ever think about those Roman soldiers, Watson?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "Why do you ask?" "I've been reflecting on the nature of their vigil," he said, his gaze on the bronze raven. "They remained at their post for a purpose that became irrelevant. Rome did not return. Their specific duty became moot. Yet their faithfulness served a larger purpose they could not have anticipated. They preserved something valuable, though not in the way they intended." "Are you suggesting there's a parallel to our work?" I asked, sensing where his thoughts were leading. "Perhaps," he said slowly. "We solve cases, catch criminals, restore a measure of order to our small corner of the world. The immediate purposes seem clear. Justice served, wrongs righted, mysteries resolved. But I wonder sometimes if there's a larger pattern we serve without quite seeing it, some contribution we make to the fabric of civilization that goes beyond individual cases." "That's unusually philosophical for you, Holmes," I observed with a smile. "Blame the influence of Sir Edmund and his Romans," he replied, returning the smile. "Their story has affected me more than I anticipated. The dedication to duty across such impossible spans of time, the faith that their actions mattered even when all evidence suggested futility. There's something admirable in that, something that resonates. You see yourself in them. Perhaps I do, though I hope I shall not end my days trapped in darkness, faithful to a purpose whose time has passed." "You won't," I assured him. "Your work is too immediate, too connected to the living world to become obsolete. Crime will always exist, and while it does, there will be need for minds like yours to combat it." A comforting thought, Watson, though one could argue that the Romans believed their empire equally eternal, equally necessary to human order. They were wrong, as it turned out. All things end, including the need for consulting detectives. "But not tonight," I said firmly. "Tonight we are needed. Our work continues, and the mysteries of London await your remarkable abilities." "Not tonight," he agreed, reaching for his violin. "Tonight we've earned a measure of peace." He began to play one of his own compositions, a haunting melody that seemed to capture something of our recent experiences. The mystery, the discovery, the near tragedy averted, the satisfaction of truth revealed. The music filled our rooms, floating out into the London evening, joining the city's endless symphony of sound and life. The violin's song wound through melodies both melancholy and hopeful, mirroring the complexity of our recent adventure. I found my thoughts drifting, following the music into that space between waking and sleeping, where ideas float free of logic's constraints, and anything seems possible. The music slowed, gentled, became a lullaby of sorts, and I felt myself slipping towards sleep, despite my intention to remain awake and attentive. Holmes's playing had this effect sometimes, this ability to lull the mind into peaceful surrender, and I did not fight it. The day's thoughts had been rich enough, full enough, and now rest called with an insistence that seemed both natural and earned. As consciousness faded, my last awareness was of the music continuing, of Holmes playing into the night, and of the bronze raven watching over us both. That ancient symbol of watchfulness and wisdom, standing guard on our mantelpiece, as others of its kind had stood guard over Roman treasures, as Holmes stood guard over truth and justice, as we all in our various ways stand guard over what we hold precious. The music became distant, dreamlike, blending with the sounds of London settling into its own version of sleep. The city that never truly rested, but which quieted in the deep hours, gathering itself for the next day's demands. And in that quieting, in that transition from day to night, from activity to rest, from consciousness to dreams, there was a kind of perfection, a rightness that needed no explanation or justification. Everything was as it should be. The mystery had been solved, the man saved, the discovery preserved. We had done what we came to do, and now we returned to our proper place, ready for whatever the next day would bring. The pattern continued, the work went on, and in that continuation lay both purpose and peace. The music faded into silence, or perhaps into sleep, and the night claimed its due, gentle and irresistible, carrying me into dreams where Romans and detectives walked side by side through chambers filled with light and shadow, seeking truths that waited patiently to be discovered, faithful as stone, persistent as time itself. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of this tale of winter disappearance and ancient discoveries, of mysteries layered across time like sediment in stone, each era leaving its mark for those with eyes to see and patience to search. Sir Edmund Ashford found his truth in the darkness beneath his ancestral home, paid for it with suffering, and emerged transformed, his life's work validated by a discovery that will echo through scholarly halls for generations to come. Holmes and I returned to our familiar routines, carrying with us the memory of those days in Northumberland, the satisfaction of a life saved and a mystery solved, and the strange gift of the bronze raven that reminds us still of the persistence of truth across all the barriers of time. The chambers beneath Ravenswood Manor continue to yield their secrets under careful archaeological study, each artifact and inscription adding to our understanding of that turbulent period when Rome's grip on Britain loosened and slipped away. The Roman soldiers who kept their lonely vigil have been honoured and remembered, their dedication acknowledged across the vast gulf of years, their faith in duty vindicated by the preservation it achieved. The past is never truly past, dear listener. It exists beneath our feet, within our walls, in layers of meaning waiting for discovery. And the future holds mysteries we cannot yet imagine, truths that will seem as strange and wonderful to those who uncover them as Roman chambers seem to us. The work continues, the search goes on, and in that continuation lies hope. Hope that truth matters, that dedication serves purposes beyond our seeing, that the light we push against the darkness, however small, contributes to illumination beyond our understanding. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you this thought. You are part of that pattern, that great tapestry of human curiosity and dedication that stretches from those Roman soldiers to Sir Edmund Ashford, to all of us who seek truth in our own ways. Your watchfulness, your curiosity, your faith that understanding matters. These are not small things. They are the threads from which meaning is woven, the lights by which others may find their way, the vigil that connects us across all the barriers that seem to separate. Rest well, knowing that mysteries will wait for you, that truth persists patient as stone, and that the search continues in countless hearts and minds, each contributing to that great work of understanding that defines us as human and gives purpose to our brief passage through time. If you enjoyed this journey into mystery and history, this gentle exploration of disappearance and discovery, please consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like. Your support allows more stories like this to be told, more journeys into the shadows and back into the light. Share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight, and what mysteries call to your curious mind? Until we meet again in the next tale, I wish you peaceful sleep, pleasant dreams, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that somewhere, always, truth waits to be discovered and stories wait to be told. Good night, dear listener. May your rest be deep, your dreams be gentle, and your waking bring the promise of new mysteries to explore and new truths to uncover. Sleep well,